From 1.5 million years ago until the emergence of modern people, the world was dominated by one type of ancestral human. We call these people Homo Erectus, and they represent one of the most crucial stages in the making of mankind. If you go back to Africa 1.5 million years ago, you would come across small bands of these people. You would certainly recognize them as human. We have enough fossils to reconstruct their physical appearance, as we have done with these actors. But how can we tell anything at all about the way they behaved? How can we tell how their society was organized? What did they eat, and how did they obtain their food? Can we say if males and females had different roles? How intelligent were they? To understand why our species succeeded, we have to find some way of understanding these distant ancestors, for most of our distinctive human behavior began with them.
When this marvelous Homo erectus skull was found here at Turkana in 1975, I was delighted. Not only because it's such a perfect specimen, but also it answered many questions. It cleared up many outstanding problems. It put all our previous discoveries into a perspective. In Africa, we have a large number of fossil ancestors that go back almost to 4 million years. The discovery of a classic erectus at 1.5 million years ago in Africa, I think, establishes beyond any doubt that erectus evolved in Africa. Similarly, I think it's fair to say that the behavior that is almost certainly a part of the erectus character also evolved in Africa. The question is, how much can we really learn about behavior of our early ancestors by looking at old bones? Well, not very much, but there are other ways of going about it.
Since 1977, a team of archaeologists from the Kubifora Research Station at Lake Turkana in Kenya has been searching for clues to our past way of life. What they've come to find is evidence that's been buried here for over 1.5 million years. The co-director of the Kubifora project is my colleague Glenn Isaac. He is an archaeologist, and he leads a team that includes a variety of specialists who study the stone tools, the animal bones, the sediments, and the ecology. Their first job is to set up camp. They stay here for up to 4 months every year. It's a remote part of the world. All supplies for their stay have to come up on a hot, dusty 2-hour drive from base camp, which itself is a hard 2-day drive from Nairobi. It's a major organizational job, with literally tons of equipment needed. The people working here often reflect that what they're doing was also done, although of course in a less sophisticated way, by those distant ancestors that they're investigating. All humans, when they stay anywhere for any length of time, create a home base, a place to which they can return each day. When they leave it, they leave traces behind. They think that's exactly what happened here over 1.5 million years ago. This is Site 50. It's one of a number of very ancient archaeological sites being investigated along the shores of Lake Turkana. We are all familiar with the way archaeologists try to create a picture of past society when they dig up remains of civilizations a few thousand years old, like that of the Sumerians or the Egyptians or Anglo-Saxons. But how do you start with a site that's been buried for 1.5 million years? How do you even find it in the first place?
This one was found a couple of years ago by two colleagues, Jack Harris and Paul Abel, who, coming along this area, found on the slope a trail of fossil bone fragments and stone artifacts. Here's a large stone flake, the kind struck by a proto-human 1.5 million years ago. Here a small lava chopper, just apparently tumbling down the slope. And the trail can be followed up, and its highest point appears to be over here, where we have a little cluster, a long bone here, a sharp lava flake here, and this tip of a pig tusk. And this seems to indicate that this layer just above, see over here, is the source of these objects, and that this would be a good place to excavate.
This sort of archaeology depends on the careful peeling off of successive thin layers of earth over a large area. In this way, they progress step by step towards the original surface. They move down 5 centimeters at a time, and as they go down, they're of course going further and further back in time. As each layer is peeled off, anything of interest is removed for further investigation. But they're not only interested in the fragments they find here. They're trying to build up a picture of what the original site looked like. They can learn a lot from the sediments and also from the fossil pollen found trapped in the earth.
The first thing to realize is that the modern landscape bears very, very little resemblance to the ancient landscape at the time when these sites formed. The ancient landscape was a more or less featureless, flat floodplain which extended some 15-20 kilometers behind me over to by the lake, the ancient lake, and 15-20 kilometers in that direction to the hills that bound the lake basin. And what we've done in this excavation is to expose a small window, as it were, into a part of this ancient floodplain, and that's what the floor of this excavation essentially is. It's part of the floodplain, and we followed it in our excavation across the site over to the far end where the fossil riverbank is. And so if one wants to understand what the site looked like when it formed, then one has to think of a river channel which swept round behind what is now this hill. The hill wasn't there, curved round the site, so that the site was in a place where the floodplain just projected into a curve in the river. The evidence shows that the river would have been lined with trees, providing shade. After the site was used, the river continued to flood at intervals, bringing muddy water up over its bank onto the flat floodplain and burying whatever was lying on the ancient surface with more silt and mud, and that's what our excavation is peeling off.
At a certain depth in the excavations, they found that the density of bone and stone fragments was increasing dramatically. In all, they've recovered from this site over 1,500 stone fragments and some 2,000 pieces of bone, like this wildebeest rib. Every piece has been carefully preserved. The question is, how did it all get here?
88.12 east, 92.80 south.
Fragments of bone and any number of stones can be found all over the surrounding countryside. By plotting the position of every piece on Site 50, they're trying to see if the scatter is any different, if it has any pattern. If it does, it might show that it was the result of humans living on the site. But before they can definitely say that, they have to eliminate all the other possibilities.
30 east, 77 south. 30, 77.
With this plan of the excavation, they can put the fragments back as they were found.
Yes. 21.
You can see immediately the problems they're facing. Couldn't this be just a random scatter with bones and stones swept here by an ancient stream? Couldn't these stones have been naturally broken? Couldn't the bones be the ancient remains of a lion's or a hyena's meal? Perhaps the whole assemblage has got nothing to do with our ancestors at all. That's the kind of problem that Glynn and his team are up against.
At first sight, the ensemble looks a bit like a dog's breakfast, you might say. But the presence of the broken sharp stones encourages archaeologists to think that this may very well be a place where early humans 1.5 million years ago were repeatedly active. And we tackle the study rather in the manner of detectives, trying to find what order there is, what clues there are to the kind of pattern of life that existed here in those remote times.
The first question is whether these stones are really tools. To find out, they did some experiments. Nick Toth is an experienced stone tool maker. He's made around 1,000 pebble tools like this one. Using the same type of stone as occurs at the site, he's found that when you hit it, it always breaks in much the same way. Man-made fractures are always quite different from any other pattern of fracture. Compared to the ancient stone artifact, Nick's is almost identical. Another line of evidence is to study the scatterer flakes created by the making of a stone tool. If someone had worked like this on Site 50, is there any way of using the flakes to prove it? Clearly, these flakes could be fitted back together again to reconstruct the original stone that Nick had been working on. So if anyone had actually made stone tools on Site 50, it might be possible to prove it in the same way. In many cases, it is possible. So, the fact that the flakes fit back together again is further proof that the tools are man-made. This is the 1.5 million year old tool. Look at the flakes at the top, and now compare them with the flakes that Nick made recently. It's more evidence that someone was working on the site in the same way as Nick does. But what were these tools used for? Dr. Mark Newcomer of London University made a number of stone tools and used them on various materials. For example, to cut meat, to cut wood, to scrape or whittle wood, to cut fur and skin. These tools were then sent to Dr. Lawrence Keeley in America, who had to see whether he could tell what they'd been used for, simply by examining them through a microscope.
Okay, this first piece, which is typical of the pieces that were sent to me, is of this black English chalk flint. In this particular case, there has been a notch created here by a single blow, which is very probably the area of the implement which is used. See what we can see on the edge. Here we have a microwear polish along this edge, which you can see here as a brighter spots along here, extending back from the edge some ways in small patches and beginning to peter out. And a number of experiments have demonstrated that this polish is particularly caused by the use on wood. Other polishes may be distinguished because they have other characteristics. They're either not so bright or not so smooth. And so in this case, I would say that this implement has very definitely been used on wood. And since the shape of the edge is concave, I would say that it was whittling a circular piece of wood, a small branch of some kind. The second piece here is something completely different. Here we have the polish along in this area here. It's not as clear as in the last piece we saw, and it's much rougher. In this case, has even a greasy appearance under the microscope, and this polish is characteristic of use on meat. And there are some striations I noticed which are parallel with the edge, which indicate a cutting function. So this implement is a meat knife.
Right again. In all, Keeley examined 15 stone tools, and in every case but one he had worked out correctly what they had been used for. Knowing that the method worked, he could then turn with some confidence to material from Glynn's Site 50.
It's approximately 1.5 million years old, and I must say that it makes for some difficulty in interpretation because the oldest material I've looked at previously has been no more than about 250,000 years old. But in this case, there is actually a alteration on the surface which really does look rather like a microwear polish. We have here some areas of polish here. I think you can see high ridges running down to the edge of the implement, and they're covered with a very bright polish, that is, it reflects a lot of light, and very smooth. Now, normally this polish is, such a polish is characteristic of plant cutting uses and cutting particularly soft plant materials. So indeed, this would be extremely interesting if it was truly plant polish, because we have certainly good circumstantial evidence that we have use of tools on meat by the people occupying these sites, but this would be first evidence we would have of them using plant. But again, it will take some more time to be absolutely certain that we're looking at a microwear polish that's 1.5 million years old.
Besides the stones found here, the bones also present problems. Henry Bunn is trying to find out whether these animal remains got here because humans brought them in for food, or if there is some other explanation. One way to find out is again to look at the way they've been broken. There are many ways to break a bone. But if you do it like this, you will lose the very thing you're trying to get at, the bone marrow. And the sort of fracture you end up with clearly doesn't match the pattern of fossil bone. But if you give a bone a series of sharp blows with a stone tool, it invariably breaks in a characteristic way that also happens to be ideal for removing the marrow. It can be easily pulled apart and none of the marrow is lost. The fresh bone and the fossil have been broken in almost identical ways. So it's more than likely that it was humans that were bringing in these remains and breaking them open. Even more convincing evidence of meat eating came from a spot close to Site 50, where Henry found a pile of fossil animal bones eroding on the surface. Were these bones here as a result of animals simply dying or having been swept in by water? Although there were no stone tools at this spot, Henry noticed that on one of the bones there were very faint marks, quite unlike tooth or claw marks. It is evidence that meat was once sliced off this bone with a stone tool. The kind of detailed experimental work that Glynn and his team are doing is the first step to understanding the behavior of our ancestors.
Really nice percussion marks coming from this direction, and flakes taken out of the internal.
They can now begin to understand the patterns of evidence left behind by our distant ancestors.
Modern femur that we broke the other day. You see, it's got the same mark right there. It's hit.
They know how the stone tools at site were made, and they can show how the bones broken there by stones are different from those broken naturally or chewed by carnivores.
Has the same sort of flake scar, but the surface is more...
And all this makes them quite sure that this really was a place where our ancestors once lived and worked.
So, what do we learn from this litter of material that we've painstakingly excavated over many months? First of all, that it is litter. It's the sort of Stone Age equivalent of the kind of garbage that's left lying around at a picnic site or a campsite. And one of the species-specific characteristics of humans is that they're litter bugs. And we can see that that began a long time ago. So we learn out of this that the proto-humans who established this litter of material were carrying things. They were tool-made. They were eating more meat than most primates do, and they were carrying food back to a central place, which makes it seem that this patch of material is, as it were, a fossil home base. And the carrying of food is a very unusual behavior that amongst primates really only humans engage in. The implications from what we know of wildlife today would be that really in a human primate society only the most mobile members could go in pursuit of meat. Women encumbered with children would really find it difficult to be part of that activity. And the strong possibility then, the suggestion if you like, is at this side that a pattern had begun to exist in which males and females, men and particularly women with children, had somewhat different roles, that there was a division of labour. And this in turn opens up other demands on human abilities that may help us to understand the rest of human evolution. So while we can see in a site like this that some of the fundamental distinctive features of human behaviour were already established, I don't think that at all means that these creatures who lived here 1.5 million years ago were fully human, that we want them in our own drawing room. We would recognize them simply as us. It's very likely that they had much less communicative and language abilities. But a pattern of life involving tool making, hunting, a division of labor, puts a demand on ability to communicate. It also, your standard of living is likely to rise, as it were, if you are able in subtle ways to communicate with the other members of your cooperating group. The chances of survival go up. And so one, in a sense, can see the situation 1.5 million years ago as a kind of springboard of which the rest of human evolution, the refinement of communication abilities, the development of the human intellect, this ability to plan long chains of steps into the future that we all now have, took off.
The evidence of bones and stones has certainly made our picture much clearer. We can use it to reconstruct more precisely what might have been going on, not only at Site 50, but in other places as well, where our ancestors lived. The physical evidence is real enough, but when it comes to behavior patterns, like the sharing of food, we're still making assumptions. Archaeology can only present a partial picture. It can only hint at the complexity of social organisation that might have existed in such groups. It needs to be supported and reinforced by a different kind of evidence. This is the Kalahari Desert in northern Botswana. I came here to look at things that the archaeological record can never reveal, by looking at one of the few groups of people who still practice the hunter-gatherer way of life. The people who live here used to be called Bushmen, but now they're called the Kung. The Kung have lived in southern Africa for at least 11,000 years. They are not as isolated as they used to be, and they no longer move with the seasons from waterhole to waterhole. The majority have taken to living in semi-permanent villages, although they still will spend time in temporary camps in the open, like this one. They've adopted modern, Western-style clothes, and tobacco obtained from local trading posts is increasingly popular. Despite this, they still get much of their food gathering and hunting, as our ancestors did. These people are not living fossils. They are fully modern people, but they can demonstrate a way of life that is as old as humanity, a vital part of our heritage. The Kung speak an unusual language, full of strange glottal stops and clicks.
Magongo nuts.
My interpreter and guide was Richard Lee, an anthropologist from Toronto, who spent 15 years studying the Kung.
I see, that's an unroasted magongo.
Yeah, that's a fresh one. And now she's cracking a roasted one.
With his help, I talked with them, and I also shared their basic food, the magongo nut.
You were cooking the whole nut.
That's what they make the fruit out of.
Yeah, in fact, we could just sort of nibble at it like eating an apple. Yeah.
They told me that they still gather about half of their food for themselves.
This one. I'm very stupid. Very good. This is like it's got sugar with it. Very good, isn't it?
It's got sugar, and then the nut meat itself has got a high-quality protein,
yeah.
so it's not a bad combination at all.
Marvelous. Me?
You'll be me is fat, so that makes you fat.
Don't you think I'm too thin? She's laughing at me.
There's a myth that has grown up around hunter-gatherers that their life they lead is harsh, aggressive. The whole notion of life in the state of nature as being nasty, brutish, and short. But the reality that we find, even in this quite harsh environment of the Kalahari Desert, is really quite different. The Kalahari is not a desert in the strict sense of the word. The rainfall is low, but there really is a lot of vegetation in the environment. And in fact, even though the situation may look unpromising, life for the not a bleak struggle for existence. There is a surprising amount of food available to the Kung. Over 100 species of vegetable foods and over 50 species of game. So that with this tremendous variety, they are able to do quite nicely on a very leisurely work schedule. These Kung have left their semi-permanent villages to make a brief trip out to Mongongo forests, where they will spend a few days gathering wild foods and hunting game. And here we have 6 or 8 family groups coming into camp, and when they make their fires and set up their sleeping places, they arrange themselves in terms of kinship groups. The women who are not with their husbands have a special area in the center of the camp, and unmarried men too have another special area on the edge of the camp. But everybody is within arm's reach of everybody else, so that food can be passed relatively easy from one fire to another.
There are about 30 people in this group, and it's interesting that throughout the world, hunter-gatherer peoples tend to live in groups of this size. It probably goes back a long way. Glenn Isaac estimates that his archaeological site was also occupied by about 30 people. It seems to be the ideal number for exploiting the plant and animal foods they live on. Many more people and the natural resources of the area couldn't support them easily. In a smaller group, the social structure would be weakened. The kind of home base or camp that the Kung are creating here is a distinctive feature of human behavior. Indeed, without it, there would be little of the archaeology we saw at Site 50. Other animals do mark off territory. Some apes and monkeys return to their favorite trees or cliffs. But it's only humans that create temporary or permanent bases like this. A home, a place where men, women and children return after a day collecting food, where the very young, the old and the sick can be cared for. By observing this group, we can gain some insights into a pattern of life that was also the pattern of life of our ancestors. The day begins with the women leaving camp. In most hunter-gatherer societies, there is a division of labor, and the Kung are no exception. The women are largely responsible for the gathering of vegetable foods, of which the most important is the one I sampled earlier, the magongo nut.
This nut grows in long groves on the tops of fossil dunes. The nut provides a considerable proportion of the vegetable diet of the traditional Kung, and is a remarkably nutritious food, which provides something like 600 calories per 100 grams, which is twice as many calories and about twice as much protein as you would get in an equivalent amount of steak. In addition to the mongongo, they have many other excellent wild foods in their diet. For example, you have many roots and bulbs in the diet, about 40 species in all. These roots provide carbohydrate and fluid and fiber. Besides that, they have the kamako berry. This kamako berry is found almost abundantly as the mongongo, and although it's not as high in protein as the mongongo, it is a good source of carbohydrate and sugar. And so, taking all these foods together, we have a very well-rounded diet for the Kung.
Very nice.
It's quite sweet.
Kamako.
Mm-hmm. roughly
And
40.
do they eat them when they're out gathering, or do they take a lot back? I mean, everyone seems to be eating as much as I am.
They eat about half on the way and then bring half back to camp with them.
The early archaeological record will never reveal the great importance of vegetable food. I am sure that vegetables and fruit must have been equally important for our ancestors. I would assume that the women, as here and as in most other hunter-gatherer groups, must have spent much of their time gathering and preparing these foods. It's often been assumed from anthropological studies that the separate role is also an inferior one, that their status in most modern societies is an inevitable result of our long hunter-gatherer past. The Kung, however, show this to be a complete fallacy.
There's this view that because women are the carriers, the bearers of children, and because they have housework to do, that somehow or other they're second-class citizens. In the case of the Kung, this is simply not so. In fact, the women have important power in several key areas. One is that because they bear the children, as the men themselves say, without the women there would be no society at all. A second area is in the area of food. And in fact, the women provide more of the food of the camp than the men do. And so the influence they have in these two areas gives them influence in the general discussions about decisions to be made and so on. So in fact, what we see here is a real equality between the sexes.
I'm quite sure women played a crucial role in the success of early human societies, just as they do here. Indeed, it's possible to argue that it was the women, rather than the men, who were the first inventors and toolmakers. Something like this sling, perhaps, a simple square of material with two tie strings, would be needed for a mother to carry her baby. It can equally well be used for carrying nuts and berries. Slings, containers for vegetables, digging sticks, all these probably preceded stone tools and were probably used by women. Here again, the archaeological record is biased because these things are rarely preserved. Nonetheless, it is true that women encumbered by babies and toddlers would be limited in what they could do as hunters, and hunting game for meat must generally have been a male activity. Man the hunter remains a powerful image. It's been suggested that the challenge and skills of hunting are the major reasons for the enlargement of our brain and the success of our species. Our ancestors certainly would have needed the same sort of skills as the Kung, although their weapons, of course, would have been much less sophisticated.
The main hunting weapon is the bow and the poisoned arrow. And the poison comes from the grub of a beetle. In preparing to hunt, the men carefully take out their arrows and may open up one of these grubs and apply touches of poison to touch up a previously poisoned arrow. This makes the poison particularly potent. And then, when everybody is ready, in twos and threes in small groups, the men go out to hunt.
Hunting does require rather special skills. It's a fair assumption that, like the Kung, our ancestors knew the terrain well and were quite familiar with the habits of animals. The ability to follow tracks and to interpret spoor was as vital to them as it is to the Kung. We followed two of the hunters, and shortly after leaving camp, they came upon some tracks which to them told a whole story.
It's a male warthog. A big one. How many out here, Quinky? Last night. Chisa, it came through last night. Chisa heri aheri au gaiwa kana go gai.
I'm sorry.
Hey.
I go quite. Ho, I got
We wouldn't hunt it now because it feeds at night on the Mongongo forest, and then in the morning it goes into the burrow and sleeps.
Would they follow the tracks to the burrow?
He says, yes, we would follow this one, and we might find it on the surface. We would shoot it. If it was in a burrow, we might smoke it out or wait for it to come out. When the men start out tracking, the discussion is free and casual. As they sight fresh spoor, they become more serious and they begin to talk in whispers. And when the spoor is very fresh, they stop speaking entirely and start gesturing to each other with hand signals. And then in the final stages of the approach, they may stop even these signals and get down on all fours and creep the last 50 yards on their hands and knees before taking a shot. On this occasion, they gave up the chase after about an hour. The success rate for hunting is not spectacular. A hunter will actually bring home meat on one day in 4 days of hunting. And the men say that it is fortunate indeed that they have the vegetable foods because that will give them the strength to hunt. If we really want to look at what is the kernel, what is the nub of this whole system, this whole society, it is really sharing. Not hunting, it's not gathering, but sharing. Because this is the key element that made us humans what we are, and this is what we see in its purest form in societies such as these hunting and gathering societies. Food is not hoarded, it is brought in to the camp, a mouthful goes here, a spoonful goes there, it travels from one fire to another, and especially in the case of meat, there's a much more formal, complex set of rules by which the meat is distributed around the camp. So the net result is that it's like 30 people, in effect, sitting around the dinner table, sharing a meal together.
No other primate shares food like this. I'm sure food sharing at a home base was established long ago and became a fundamental part of behavior. This is not a pattern that was consciously designed, as one might, for example, plan a social event. It was much more basic than that, developing from some fundamental social and sexual characteristics of our species. The human baby is born with a brain that's only a quarter of adult size. Any bigger and the head couldn't pass through the mother's birth canal. One consequence is that most brain growth in humans happens outside the womb. So, human infants are helpless at birth and unable to begin to fend for themselves until about 7 or 8 years of age. This long dependence of infants on their mothers, longer than in any other animal, must have shaped human society from earliest times, placing restrictions on females and encouraging a division of labour within a group. Offspring were more likely to survive and to reach maturity if the task of raising them was shared. So, from the point of view of the female, it became necessary to lay claims to the services of at least one male who would provide food and protection for her and her offspring. This would lead to the strengthening of special bonds between male, female, and infants. It would lead to a move towards family and kinship groupings. And this meant that the sharing of food and the division of labour was to become a crucial part of the human strategy for survival. In this strategy, the role of both sexes was equally important.
What we have learned from observations on the Kung and other hunter-gatherers is the tremendous importance of this type of situation, the mutual dependence of one individual on the other. Indeed, I'm sure that our early ancestors must have developed this way back in time. I'm sure that the division of labour, the communal approach to life, was an essential ingredient in terms of the successful development of humanity. Indeed, it was that which set us apart from all other forms of life.
I must stress again that the Kung are fully modern people. They are not the same as our distant ancestors. They are us. But the archaeological evidence shows that the pattern of life demonstrated so well by the Kung had begun millions of years ago, and the Kung themselves show us how elaborate those patterns might have been. It was a way of life that had made Homo erectus the most sophisticated animal on Earth.
The archaeological record and the fossils speak very clearly. This way of life almost certainly developed in Africa a long time ago. All of us can trace our origins to Africa. Darwin was right. Man began in Africa. All people, not just the ape men. About 1.5 million years ago, a very important new phase in our story begins. For the first time, bands of people began to move out of Africa into other parts of the world.
With Homo erectus, the great expansion of man had begun. It was to lead eventually to the occupation by our species of every part of the globe.
The material on this video cassette is protected by copyright. It is for private use only, and any other use, including copying, reproducing, or performance in public, in whole or in part, is prohibited by law.